One of the central beliefs of manosphere ideology is the idea that female nature is that of natural hypergamy. They call this the instinctual urge for women to seek out the best alpha available. This is marked by maximizing rejection, therefore women are the selective gender. A woman will vet her alpha through various shit tests to ensure his health on the alpha scale. She is conditioned to recognize a declining alpha, as hypergamy also tends to continue seeking out higher status males, even while with an alpha male. Shit tests allow her to prepare herself for eventually leaving when a new, higher status male is found. If the male fails shit tests to a great enough degree, it will affect her feelings for him. He will effectively lower his sexual market value in her eyes. This will enable her to jump to the next male with ease and little remorse. Now, as with most manosphere philosophy, this isn't backed up by any data. This is mainly backed up by a whole lot of anecdotes. And if you're the kind of person who has already rage clicked off of this video within the first 30 seconds without really hearing me out on this, you're probably going to be surprised by what I say next, because in spite of this definition, hypergamy is a real thing and it exists now, and we should talk about it. Now, the problem is that much of the red pill or other manosphere belief systems revolve around a misunderstanding of real psychological and sociological phenomenon, which is to say that they find things that actually exist and then either through ignorance or purposeful obfuscation twist them to meet their own ideological ends, which in this case is really, really annoying because you could make an extremely good case for hypergamy without the twisting, as I'm going to in this video. In this video, I want to talk about how hypergamy is something that is very much alive in our modern society. And this seems to be in spite of the fact that men and women are on more of an equal footing than ever before in life. Because here's the thing about the red pill and the manosphere and other parts of it, there's a whole lot of points that I agree with. Hypergamy is just one of the examples of certain things within these ideologies that I believe are real and that are backed up by data and that I can present. But the problem is these ideas are typically wrapped around some kind of vitriolic hatred of women. And for the most part, I don't really hate anyone. And so I feel that makes me a little bit better equipped to actually talk about these issues in a way that means that we might actually be able to address them. That's right, my channel with a little under 130 subscribers is going to be the driving force of social change going forward. But before we get into exactly what hypergamy is and how do we deal with it, we have to first understand why the massive, long, kind of crazy definition that I gave at the beginning of this video for what hypergamy is in fact wrong. And why it's wrong. You see, talk of alphas and shit tests and women always looking for another meal ticket seems to paint this idea of all women as these manipulative gold diggers who cannot wait for their next sugar daddy to come along. This conflation and generalization is about as transparent as one of those prank videos where a guy walks up to like this super hot girl and he's all scrawny and stuff and he's dressed poorly and he looks awful all round and he asks her to go like have a drink with him and she's like, ew, no, you look really gross and you look like you're broke and I don't date guys like that. And then he kind of walks away and gets into his Lamborghini, which is conveniently parked just off screen, which she no doubt would have seen. This is the only person around. And he was no doubt hanging around his Lambo, because who leaves their Lambo just out on a beach with no one around it? And then he drives off, but before he can drive off, she's like, oh my god, I made a mistake, let's go get that drink. And he's like, haha, no bitch. And he drives off, our victorious and sexless champion. And whilst we will get into this whole idea of status a little bit further along in this video, this definition of women as these devious super manipulators is just simply ludicrous, showing them as these people who are always testing the man that they are with until he fails just enough tests for her emotion meter to drop below critical level, whereupon she feels good enough to say, okie dokie, on to the next alpha. What? And of course this is made out to be this natural thing, this instinctual urge, this biological imperative. And whilst women are as much driven by biology as literally everyone else is, no one is a slave to their biological instincts. It's why we no longer leave disabled kids out in the cold or crack their heads open with rocks. We have evolved a little bit past just doing whatever our lizard brain tells us to do. And so there is no evidence for the aforementioned definition of hypergamy. And quite frankly, it sounds downright conspiratorial, almost as if it was written by somebody who perhaps doesn't really like women all that much. But that's pure speculation on my part, and far be it from me to cast any aspersions. There are no studies that indicate that women are constantly evaluating their alpha male on this scale of alpha-ness, and when he falls below like a certain threshold, they kick him to the curb, of course take half of his money and assets in divorce, and then move on just to a slightly higher rung on the alpha ladder, all trying to eventually get to what I can only assume is like a super alpha at the top. But with all that in mind, let's set all of that aside and let's actually talk about what hypergamy is in actual reality. So in its kind of definitional form, definitional of course being a word that I've got no idea if it means what I think it means, but it basically means the act of marrying up. Now of course we can kind of extract a little bit further out from marrying, but let's stick with that for now, just for the sake of simplicity. Hypergamy is the act of marrying up. It is something that originated in the Indian caste system, and the term hypergamy, or at least its translated term, can actually be found in kind of older Hindu law texts. I'm not an expert on this, of course. I read this on Wikipedia like literally any other person could do. Hypergamy was when you married into a family of either equal or higher caste than yours. And whilst caste systems don't ostensibly exist in whatever modern Western society is, the concept of hypergamy does indeed persist. However, it is important to note that hypergamy is not this unidimensional concept. There are in fact multiple dimensions of hypergamy and how that works, and specifically how that works across different genders, and a whole lot more that goes into it. So let's talk about that. So if you ask someone in the manosphere about hypergamy, they're probably going to point to the most obvious example of it, the example that everyone seems to have heard about at least at some point in their life, and that is the idea that women are hypergamous when it comes to finances. They tend to get into relationships with or tend to marry men who earn more money than them or who have more money than them. On the other hand, men seem to be hypergamous when it comes to attractiveness and youth. They tend to get into relationships with, or at least aim to get into relationships with, women who are younger than them or more attractive to them on a roughly comparable scale. And guys, let's be honest, I don't even have to bring up evidence for this. This is something that you instinctually know is true. Interestingly though, there are cases where women are not hypergamous. For example, women are what is called homogamous when it comes to education. It used to be that women were hypergamous when it came to education. They would try to marry people who were more educated than them, or rather that was really the only choice that they had because education was massively restricted. But now they tend to aim for somebody who has pretty much a similar level of education to them, or sometimes even a lower level of education to them. And this is of course only one way to look at this concept of hypergamy. It's multiple facets and dimensions and factors, and to that end, sometimes the term hypergamy or hypergamy, I don't know how it's pronounced because I couldn't find an audio file for it, is the term that is sometimes used. You see, whilst it can be viewed that women are marrying up financially, it could also be a fair characterization that men are marrying down, and various socio-cultural factors could be ascribed as the reasons for either. For example, women typically having less financial power historically, and men being the corridor to access that, or men valuing dominance and control, especially over women, and therefore marrying someone of less financial means as a method of control. And just to be clear, those are theories I literally just mostly pulled out of my ass. I found kind of allusions to them across the internet as I was researching this video, but they are more or less just as good of an explanation as women being like money hungry bitches. All of this is to say that it is far more complicated than women just being super greedy gold diggers, just looking for the next best meal ticket to come along. Now, there is a lot of debate about what the cause of hypergamy or hypergamy or hypergamy actually is, like what causes it, what factors are influencing hypergamy, which is the term I'm going to stick to for the sake of simplicity and the YouTube algorithm. As I said earlier, it's entirely possible that the reason for women's financial hypergamy is due to the historical precedent of women typically having much less money than men literally since ever. And this is something that could indeed still be bearing itself out today, putting aside the fact that it's really not been all too long since women have been massively in the workplace. We're talking like about 3 generations. So we would still have a whole bunch of women like now that were taught and that are likely still being taught by parents or grandparents that a woman's role is to be the housekeeper and that they shouldn't be focusing on careers and this and that and the other. And contrary to the beliefs of a lot of people in the manosphere communities, and please don't get on my case about this because it's a really stupid thing and I'm just going to throw a study at you and not respond to a comment about it, but the wage gap is something that still does exist. It's not like a mad amount, like 30-40%, although one could argue that any discrepancy is bad, and that would be a fair argument to make. Yes, it is something that still exists, even if you calculate in the motherhood penalty as well, which is a thing that exists. So WTF society? Right, that's enough of me being a social justice warrior for this video. There are also still a lot of social pressures for men to be the breadwinners and women to be the housekeepers. This is something that is perpetuated by both men and women, and this could be a reason why women are socially kind of programmed to be hypergamous, because it's obvious that biology isn't the only thing that's coming into this. And an interesting argument can also be made that if men want women to lower their standards of financial success to be more inclusive for everyone, then men need to lower their standards of beauty and look for women more in their league, whatever that means. Whether that argument is correct or valid, I can't say. But there is sometimes a double standard where men who are chasing younger women are now expecting them to be as financially successful as they are, and the odds are pretty high that this simply won't be the case. The fact is, the older you are, the more likely you will be to have found financial success, just on the basis of more years in the game. However, there is one thing that seems to underpin hypergamy when it comes to both men and women, and that one thing is status. Women seek higher status men in their approximation of what that is, and men seek out higher status women in their approximation of what that is. So status is not something that is exactly the same across the genders. But what exactly is status? It's not simply how much money you have or how youthful or attractive you are. And without trying to get into the weeds of what status actually is, there are basically two different types of status. Firstly, ascribed status. And this is social status assigned at birth or assumed later in life. This is based on social and cultural expectations, norms and standards. This includes traits such as age, kinship, sex, appearance, race, social group, gender, ability status, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, culture, or even caste. On the other hand, achieved status, the second type of status, is a social position that a person can acquire on the basis of merit and is earned or chosen. This includes education, occupation, marital status, accomplishments, income, and employment. Achieved status can also be success within your own social group. It can be leadership or collaboration. And gendered meanings of status are very complex and way beyond the scope of this video, because I can already sense that the video is a little bit too long, so kudos to you if you've made it this far. But one thing is very clear. The higher the amount of status you have, the easier you will find it to attract a partner in your life, both short term and long term. And again, the data backs this up, but this isn't a death sentence to you. It's not game over for anyone who isn't a 7-figure CEO who graduated from the University of Cambridge and who has a direct lineage to the throne in the UK. Like, it's not the end of the world. You don't have to be a 6'5" Chad to get the girl. The concept that we know of as hypergamy is not deterministic. It simply describes a tendency of men and women to marry up in terms of some kind of status. For women, that type of status appears to be, at least in one dimension, to do with money, but is also a whole bunch of other factors. And for men, it is things like youth and attractiveness, but again, a whole bunch of other factors. And whilst ascribed status does not change too easily, this is the stuff that you more than likely are born with. Like, if you are born Prince Harry, yes, you're going to have it a little bit easier because of your ascribed status, but you can work on your achieved status. This is something that can be improved. Now, here's the thing, because we don't have the full picture of whether hypergamy is something that is just like wired into us purely biologically, or if it is sociological or psychological or some combination of the three, the exact proportions of which are unclear, we should probably try to avoid passing any kind of moral judgment about whether hypergamy is good or bad, and just see it as something that currently is there and that we have to deal with it. Simply put, we have to accept it as a fact of life, that this is a tendency that human beings have for reasons that are currently unclear, and complaining about it, blaming all women or blaming all men is not going to solve the problem. As men, we need to work on building status, and what a lot of like male self-improvement videos will tell you is that, oh well, you need to go and become a 6-figure earner, and you need to go buy a big house, and you need to go get a super fancy sports car. And all that is not true, because it's not something that is attainable for the majority of people. And yet humanity moves forward, yet a lot of people still find happy and fulfilling relationships in spite of the fact that they are living in poverty, in a housing that is falling apart, in a country where, you know, their rights are being stripped away. Like, these things, like, they still occur. You don't need to be a billionaire. Instead, what this means is that we should be working on ourselves as men to become better men. Remember what I talked about earlier about this idea of achieved status that can come from, you know, success within our friends group. It can come from educating ourselves. It can come from finding a career that we are really passionate about. There are no hard and fast rules as to what status is and how you move up and down on this scale of status. It's no one's fault that it exists, and yes, we should probably work towards like getting rid of this kind of weird hierarchical structure, but that's a lesson in anarchy for another time that I'm not equipped to talk about on this channel. Simply haven't got the ridges in the brain to make that kind of argument. Another important thing to remember is that status isn't a zero-sum game. Because somebody has higher status than you in one area does not mean that you are inherently less of a person, and vice versa. Just because you have higher status doesn't mean that somebody else is a bum. Just focus on becoming a better version of you. Work on that achieved status, because that ascribed status is more or less over and done with. Just work on yourself. Go after the things that are going to make you happy in life, and that in and of itself is a form of status that is very attractive. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video very soon.